So a while ago, like a year and a half ago, something like that, I was asked to do a video on heaven. And what I ended up doing was I wrote an article that I posted as a note to my Facebook, and then just read the thing directly in front of the camera, and posted that as a video to YouTube. And I think I forgot the fact that I deleted that, because in my video on hell, I made a reference and I said I'll post the video. I'll post a link to my video about heaven, and I went to find it and it's gone. And I deleted it, I suppose, because I thought it sucked. More than likely, it did suck. But I decided to post a video, basically make another video where I read from that article, read from that Facebook note. Sorry, why I'm clearing my throat so often. I have some coffee here, which will totally clear my throat. And I have some fresh pipe tobacco, which also will totally cause my voice to be mellifluous and beautiful, and clear my neck out altogether. Anyways, I wanted to make another video where I read from it, and this time I'll read the script more or less, but I'll go totally off script when there's something I want to add. I don't think my thoughts really changed since I wrote this article. It was January of 2011, around the time of my birthday, actually. I think I wrote it in the bar where we were going to have my birthday party. I think I was waiting for everyone else to show up, and I had a notepad in front of me, and I wrote it down then, and then just transcribed it to Facebook later. There's stuff I would add now, which is what I'm going to do in this video. So yeah, like I said, I'm just going to directly kind of read from this, or at least skim it over and then comment on what I had written, and hopefully it works out. First I have to close every other freaking thing I haven't open on Facebook, because it'll just distract me. So here we go. I've been asked to do a video on heaven, and I feel criminally inadequate to the task. Not only do I have no insight on the topic, a roadblock which has never stopped me before, but it's honestly not something I think about a lot, which is maybe surprising. There's a song that was popular among evangelicals for a while called I Can Only Imagine. That was all about wondering what heaven was like. And I've always disliked that song almost as intensely as Mary Did You Know, which I get subjected to every single Christmas. I Can Only Imagine, on the other hand, seems to have run its course, but I hate it for the same reason I hate Mary Did You Know. They're both based on undernourished theological assumptions, and they're both a bunch of dumb speculation that just can't possibly be resolved, so why waste precious time musing about it? St. Augustine opens his Confessions with a lot of speculations posed as prayers, as questions to God. You know, when you fill up something, does that mean there's a little bit of you that's filled it up and there's a lot of you that's left over, or how does that work? But he's doing that to make a theological point. He's going to give a sort of resolution to all of that, in a way that both helps us to understand God better and consequently to love Him more. These songs to me just have the quality of listening to your own voice blather on instead of reacting to the mysteries of the faith with the silence that's appropriate to them. They both remind me a bit of St. Peter when he saw Christ transfigured on the mountain, you know, and Moses and Elijah showed up, and he just started talking. He didn't know what to say, the scripture says, and so he said, you know, let's build some tabernacles here for you, and da-da-da-da. Those songs both sound like St. Peter's blathering, just put to lyrical form. I can only speak for myself. Now, I'm going to come back to that line in a minute here. I can only speak for myself, but I always get annoyed whenever my imagination strays heavenward, just because I'm so strongly conscious of how inadequate my pictures of it are. And that legitimately annoys me so much that I don't even bother. Have you ever listened to, like a little kid or somebody in junior high, or someone who's just starting to learn about political concepts and thinks he's smart because he knows all these words that the other kids in his class don't know? Have you ever overheard a kid like that talking to his friends or trying to opine about local politics or federal politics in an informed way, and he just sounds like a moron? He just sounds like he's using the biggest words he can find, irrespective of whether he knows what they mean or not. Do you remember the conversations you probably had? If you're the kind of person who's watching a video like this, you're probably theologically, philosophically inclined. Do you remember when you first started thinking that way, and you started talking about these concepts that were way over your head, and how dumb you sounded in retrospect? That's kind of how I feel whenever I think or talk about heaven. I just feel embarrassed for myself. Now, like I said, when I first wrote this, I said, I can only speak for myself, but I hate that. someone here on YouTube, Murdos06, aka Eric Delamas, and yeah, I'm probably saying your name wrong, which I feel bad about because you're such a big fan of mine, but he commented and said, and maybe I'll just read it directly, in fact. He's an artist, in addition to being, a Catholic apologist and thinker of sorts. He says, "You speak for me as well. This is the exact attitude that arises in me when my mom asks me to make literal, straightforward art of heavenly imagery, such as angels. It goes without saying that this strains our relationship at times. I just don't feel comfortable with it. I know beforehand that I can't and won't ever do it justice, so why offend its existence with my attempt? In my opinion, art that emphasizes or hinges on symbolism as opposed to realism is the more appropriate response to it." Which is a comment that is going to kind of be borne out by the rest of what I wrote. Now, with that said, I'll offer some tentative reflections, but only because I've been asked. If you imagine almost anything that's pleasant or enjoyable stretched out infinitely, it almost always ends up sounding really boring. Have you ever listened to a good song so often or watched an awesome movie so many times that the effect kind of wears off? This is the problem with any of these various metaphors for heaven. The other danger that you always have there is the danger of literalism. The Quran has a lot of really sensual imagery of a paradise, about booze that doesn't give you a hangover, and beautiful fruit and stuff like this. And apparently it's all meant to be taken literally, according to the imams that I've spoken to and the scholarship that I've read. The Bible, on the other hand, seems much more deliberate in insisting on the symbolic quality of its celestial imagery. The Revelation or Apocalypse to St. John, which probably contains the most pictures of heaven in Scripture, basically comes out at the end and spells it out that everything in the book, everything that it depicts, is meant to be taken as a sign pointing to the reality of Christ. The book is riddled with imagery that's both natural, such as a woman clothed with the sun, the moon, and the stars in chapter 12, and liturgical, such as incense, a slain lamb, a temple, a lot of temple imagery, etc. Yet at the conclusion of the Apocalypse, the author records, and this is in chapter 21, verses 22 to 23, "And I saw no temple therein. For the Lord Almighty is the temple thereof, and the Lamb. And the city hath no need of the sun, nor of the moon, to shine in it, for the glory of God hath enlightened it, and the Lamb is the lamp thereof." With this in mind, consider that the book of Hebrews draws on a kind of Neoplatonic style of New Testament interpretation, and it's the same sort of exegetical style, the same hermeneutic that was used among the Hellenistic Jews after Philo, who interpreted the Torah from a Platonic allegorizing sort of style. Anyways, that interpretation in the book of Hebrews says that heaven, the temple that is in heaven, is the perfect type, the archetype of the Israelite sanctuary on earth, the temple that Moses built, which it calls the imperfect shadow of the heavenly. It's in Hebrews 8, verses 4 to 5. And there is something, at least, that can be gleaned from this. There's plenty that can be gleaned from it. For example, the fact that we shouldn't be afraid of using Greek philosophy to explain Christian theological concepts. But anyways, there's another thing that we can glean from this. Someone's thoughts about heaven are going to embody what they believe is the highest good, and therefore a picture of heaven is in some sense a guide to how someone should live or what someone should seek on earth. Like I mentioned in my video on hell, this is one of the reasons, again, why Dante is seen as such a great moral teacher. His writings about heaven, hell, and purgatory reflect what he thinks should be done on earth, which is why T.S. Eliot draws so many images from his poetry from Dante. The Wasteland, the Hollow Men, Ash Wednesday, all of these things that are about modern society are using the images from Dante, because Dante's picture of hell tells us about what vices do to us in this life. Gotta remember to keep this going. Alright, where was I? Now, the fact that pictures of heaven and hell guide how we should live on earth contrasts with the Marxist allegation that the idea of the afterlife keeps people complacent and it keeps them accepting their temporal condition. Consider the Negro spirituals, which talk about the freedom God will give his children in heaven. Not only did these songs not keep anyone from fleeing to Canada, they actively encourage people to flee to Canada. they were actually an incentive to take the Underground Railroad to Canada as soon as possible, precisely because it was just like heaven. It was a place of freedom. Notice, too, how Socrates depicts transcendent bliss, its endless dialectic, its endless conversation and debate and interaction, because, in his view, that was the highest thing you could do with your life. Now, that's an activity that some of us could conceivably do forever, those of us who are maybe prone to debate and to argument, and we would maybe think we would never get bored with it. But that's not only because we're argumentative, but because the spark of insight, that experience of thinking a new thought you've never thought before, or thinking a thought in a new kind of way, that's a pleasure that legitimately never gets old. Now, I'll just add something here. Heaven is never depicted in the Bible as being endless dialectic, the way that it is in Socrates' picture of the afterlife. Which is sort of interesting, because like I said, the reason why why Socrates uses that precise image of heaven as eternal conversation is because that's an eternal pleasure. The pleasure of thinking a new thought never gets old. Now again, Dante would see this as the beatific vision. You're looking upon truth itself, so you always have that spark of insight. Dialectic only imperfectly appropriates that truth, right? It only gets glimpses of that, which is why it's interesting that Plato's picture of the afterlife looks a lot more like the Catholic apologist view of purgatory. If you've read Peter Crave's book, Between Heaven and Hell, that's where C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley and John F. Kennedy, who all died on the same day, the Feast of St. Cecilia, November 22nd, end up in purgatory and end up debating until C.S. Lewis persuades them all that Christianity is true, and then they all go to heaven. Right, which is very similar to C.S. Lewis's own picture of purgatory and the Great Divorce. You know, there's dialectic there, there's discussion there, but when truth is actually attained, that's when you go into heaven. That's where dialectic ends. So, which kind of has a message there about the place of philosophy as the handmaiden of theology, the preparation for theology, but not the end in itself. This is pathetic. Why am I smoking while I'm talking? I'm not gonna... Anyways, whatever. I'm gonna keep trying. Now, what is the reflection of heaven in the Bible? That is to say, by extension, what is the picture in the Bible of how we should live our lives on earth? The picture of heaven in the Bible is of a sanctuary. It's worship of God, liturgical worship of God. Now, the experience of worship is the one that's projected forever forward into glory, showing that the Christian's attitude towards worship today, in time, should be as high as Socrates' regard for dialogue. I want to say something else about that. I mentioned in my other video about how hell is a conclusion that you'd come to if you think that we're immortal souls. And if we don't allow ourselves to be conformed to the image of God, to community, things like that, to self-emptying, self-sacrifice, to love, basically, to willing the highest good of another, you project that forward into eternity. If you live on Earth 70, 80 years, that can get pretty bad. You can become kind of an insufferable old man. Project that forever, you get worse and worse and worse, well, you become a demonic creature, basically. You'd be devilish, you'd be hellish. Life would be hell. Again, Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity. The opposite of that would be that if you live on Earth in such a way that you're conforming yourself to God's will and to love and so on, project that forward into eternity, throughout purgatory, and finally in its culmination, that would be heaven. Just a thought. This is just a thought. In Genesis, before the flood, humans lived, hundreds and hundreds of years. We have Methuselah, who was the oldest man who ever lived. After the flood, after people, become so rotten that the entire world needs to be purged in some sense, lifespans get shorter and shorter and shorter. Now, creationists will think of various natural explanations for this. There was an ice barrier around the Earth that collapsed at the time of the fall, or the flood, I should say. And that was the reason people could live forever or live to these extreme old ages. And once the ice barrier was gone, our lives shortened. You can do what you want with that. Here's a thought, though, maybe because, again, what we see in the flood is that human corruption had got to such a point where God was grieved. God had difficulty breathing, is what the Hebrew communicates there. He was sorrowful that he created man. Perhaps the reason why he made our lifespan so much shorter after the flood is because basically we were going to turn the earth into hell. There were so many people who, by their long 1,000-year lives on Earth, were going to get so terrible and so devilish and so beastly that they were going to basically make the Earth into hell by how evil they were. And maybe that's the reason why God shortened lifespans, so that all of our worst traits, for those of us who were going to end up creating a hell within ourselves, which is a theme I'll get to again in a second, would do that in the afterlife, would do that off on their own, without hurting God's creation. That's a thought, maybe. Does that make sense? In my video on hell, Adversus Heresies says, St. Thomas writes how after the second judgment, hell will be a place rather than merely a state of being as it is now. However, heaven, interestingly, should be a place even now, since it is where Mary was assumed into, and our Lord ascended, and it's also where Enoch and Elijah are. Thoughts? Well, here's some. Consider finally the question that Dostoevsky poses in Crime and Punishment. What if heaven, instead of being a vast palace of gold, was, and this is a quote, one little room, like a bathhouse in the country, black and grimy and spiders in every corner, and that's all eternity is. The Full Serenity Prayer, which is prayed by Alcoholics Anonymous, ends by requesting that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. It's fair, I think, to say that many churchgoers have this attitude of powering through this comparatively miserable vale of tears in hopes of ending up in a much more lush and Edenic world after their death. Kierkegaard called these the nights of infinite resignation in fear and trembling. But what if it turns out that heaven is really just a dirty bathroom where God happens to live? Well, the question then becomes, can a Christian experience God, experience ecstasy in a grimy bathroom? And of course, the answer is that many, many believers have experienced heaven in far more unsavory circumstances than that. Remember what St. John insists. That glorious, awe-inspiring imagery is all just God, the same God we have access to now. There's no temple, there's no sun. It's all the Lamb. He is the sun, he is the temple. Remember also that St. John had this vision as a dying old man, banished to and imprisoned on an island after being dumped in boiling oil and outlasting all the other apostles being murdered for their testimony. And yet in the midst of this, the Spirit of God could catch him up to heaven on the Lord's Day, and he could be in the kingdom. To all external appearances, John and scores of other believers have been in a kind of hell on earth, but their spirits were already in heaven. Why? Because they already had communion with God. As St. Catherine of Siena puts it, all the way to heaven is heaven, for Christ said, I am the way. Who needs pearly gates when you have the pearl of great price? Now, we as Catholics believe in sacraments. We believe that there are moments where heaven touches earth. And Flannery O'Connor, in her fiction, talks about the sacramental vision of the universe, sacramental imagination. And that's where God can touch us in violence, in perverse sexuality, in racism, in all these things, in these weird circumstances, in these bizarre events with these freakish people. That's exactly where grace can reach out and grab us. That's exactly where the hound of heaven can bark at us and try to bite us. In the grimy bathroom, in other words, is exactly where God might be hiding. Remember that when Francis Thompson wrote The Hound of Heaven, remember that he was an opium addict who was lost in the streets and almost died, almost committed suicide, and a prostitute rescued him and nursed him back to health. I mean, that's where The Hound of Heaven was. John Polkinghorne, who's a great, great scientist who was involved in the discovery of quarks and is also an Anglican priest, has talked about how he believes that the new creation will be a sacramental universe. Rather than just the sacraments puncturing the universe as they do now, the universe will be a sacrament. And he rejects Teilhard de Chardin. I think Chardin has a very fascinating explanation of how the universe could become a sacrament, but that's for another video. But when we're resurrected, when we have bodies, yeah, our bodies will have to be in some place. But I wonder where it is that our bodies are best transfigured with glory. I wonder in what circumstances is that? Do we find that the most? Would heaven be more like a monastery, maybe, than like a palace? I don't know. Going back to Dostoevsky's question, who's to say that heaven won't be the same as in John's situation on earth, externally miserable looking but glorious to those within? We'll consider these lines from Paradise Lost. John Milton supplies us with two of the most famous lines in English literature. When Satan first enters paradise, rather than feeling wonderful, he actually feels worse than he did in hell, that is to say, in the lake of fire, and he laments that whichever way I fly is hell, myself am hell. It's in Book 475. On the other hand, at the end of the poem, when Adam and Eve are finally driven from Eden, the angel tells them to develop faith, virtue, and love, and, quote, "Then wilt thou not be loath to leave this paradise, but shalt possess a paradise within thee, happier far." Happier far. That's in Book 12. Heaven and hell may be more than just a state of mind, but perhaps they aren't more than one state of relationship towards God. Now, in terms of, where does Mary now? Where's the Blessed Virgin? Where's Enoch? Where's Elijah? Well, they're obviously in a physical place, which is where I presume our bodies will be. Although, again, we have a new heaven and a new earth. So, the imagination, I suppose, in spite of what I said earlier, does kind of like to speculate about, we'll be going back and forth from the heavens to the new restored earth, like superheroes flying back and forth, like the transporter on Star Trek. Oh, perhaps, who knows. The point is that wherever they are, I don't think we should expect that they're in a big palace. Wherever they are is where they're most receptive to God's grace. And I mean, where was the Virgin when the Annunciation happened? Will heaven forever be that little spot by a window or wherever, where Gabriel appeared to her and told her this marvelous news that she was full of grace? Should we be averse to that? I don't think so. Here's something else, by the way, that I stole from the Reformed theologian David Chilton, who actually later became Eastern Orthodox, from what I remember anyways. In his book Paradise Restored, he mentions this motif that you see in the Bible, that wherever people are fulfilling God's covenant, wherever the community is living in accord with God's will, Eden is created there. Of course, you have the initial Garden of Eden. There's the promise of, there's the mandate to be fruitful and prosper, and this kind of thing. Then you have Noah, where the covenant is restored and given to him or whatever, and he is fruitful and prospers, right? And then you have Abraham, who's promised the land of Canaan, which the Bible describes as being this lush and beautiful place, very Edenic. In fact, I think it's the prophet Amos who actually says that it was like the garden of the Lord. In Goshen, in Egypt, and again, remember that in Exodus, read the opening chapter. It says that, the Israelites were there and they prospered and they were fruitful and multiplied, and the land of Goshen, which was protected from all the plagues, was like Eden. It was just like the garden. It's described in exactly the same way that Genesis describes paradise. Basically, and then again, especially in, say, the book of Isaiah, many of the Messianic prophecies speak of the desert being restored to being like the Garden of Eden. The wilderness, flourishes, it blossoms like a rose. I think there again, and there's not to say that there isn't. Let me go at this differently. It's precisely because, as it says in Paradise Lost, we create a paradise within ourselves. Whenever we cultivate love, wherever we love God and serve Him, whenever we fulfill our mandate, our covenant, our telos as humans. We're not Gnostics here, all right? We're not saying this is all spiritual. This is going to affect the material world around us. In fact, we are engaging with our bodies to do this. And again, this is the whole essence of the sacraments, that our bodies are so intertwined with our souls that it's precisely that the state of heaven is not just one that's exclusively part of the spirit. The body is there as well. The body is also transfigured. And this is exactly how you can find pockets of Eden in the physical earth, wherever people are following God. St. Francis of Assisi would be a really good example of that, I think, as are several other saints who are known for their relationship with nature, where around them nature just kind of aligns back into its Edenic state, into a natural harmony, because of a human love for God, of a human fulfilling His covenant. Cases like St. Francis of Assisi are the best way of understanding the Genesis covenant, I think. To have dominion over the earth. If you want to understand what that really means, look at the people who really fulfilled it. such as St. Francis and the Franciscan ideal. But the point is that's where Eden is, and I think heaven then would be a world, a place where there's a physical place where there's nothing but people fulfilling their covenant mandate, being humans, being in the image of God, and as a result the nature around them becomes Eden, becomes paradise. The words of Christ, I think, are really relevant here in the story of the thief, the good thief, who, again, in the midst of hell on earth, it would seem, being crucified, the most humiliating death possible, and being in the depths of his sins with no hope of redemption, saying to Christ, remember me when you enter into your kingdom. Again, projecting off into the future, into the day when God's finally glorified and the kingdom is brought down to earth, and this sort of thing. And Jesus turns to him, in a way turns on him and says, corrects him. He both affirms him and corrects him. He says, truly I tell you that today you will be with me in paradise. And again, I think for him that was his paradise, even there on the cross. I am by no means an expert on the Orthodox teaching on heaven and hell, which I mentioned in the other video, in spite of not being an expert on it. My understanding is that they believe in the blazing fire of God's glory, and it's the same fire that both purifies and defiles the righteous and torments the wicked. And maybe the afterlife is just like this. We are all in a dirty bathroom. The people in hell hate it, and those who love God are able to worship him and find him even there. There's a thought. The afterlife is just a big, grimy bathroom. Now, if that's the case, ask yourself now, is that enough for me? Will I be willing to live in a grimy bathroom forever if Jesus is there? And if that's the case, then why bother speculating any further about what heaven is really like? If I can be content with that, what's the point of wondering about it then? Instead, I should really focus on nurturing my love for God while I'm alive, and I won't have to wait until death for my answer about what heaven is like. And I'm quite a ways away from that. My prayer is that you aren't. Take care.